Welcome everybody to module number 10, where we'll be talking about the second part of geographies of the global economy, looking more at industry and development in this section, particularly really focusing on development, which diverges a little bit from the way it is the discussion in the textbook. Okay, so here we go. Oh, passed right by. There we go. What we're going to talk about in terms of the key points is first we're going to talk about what is development. It's actually a very contested term. And then talk about how development is measured. And then also talk about the issue of inequality. And then lastly, how should countries develop? There are a lot of different types of, or there are a lot of different theories and strategies on this. And there's been a lot of pretty heated debates about just how this gets done. So, without further ado, let's launch in. So when we talk about the idea of development, most people have heard of developed countries or underdeveloped countries or developing countries, but we need to look a little more closely at just what development means, because how we define it makes a huge difference in what we do to achieve it. So one of the best definitions that really captures everything that development is supposed to be is this thing here shown in red, which is the idea of planned change intended to improve people's lives. And there's a lot packed into this definition. Part of it is it's about the idea that development is about planning for change. It's planned. It's not just like, oh, things just change. However, development is about putting together a plan, trying to institute it, whether it's on the national level or a local level or a global level. It's about making and formulating kind of a rational plan to hopefully make things better. The second part is that it's about change. It's not saying things are okay as they are. It's saying things need to get better. There are problems with the way things are today. Tradition isn't going to help us. We need to be more modern and kind of move forward into something different. And so development is very much a forward-looking kind of perspective. The next word in here, intended, is very important because there are all sorts of projects and development plans that have intended to help people or make life better that have been miserable failures. In the last module, we talked a little bit about the Green Revolution. That is definitely a development project. It intended to improve everybody's life. Well, it improved some people's lives. It did produce more food, but it also had the unintended consequence of driving a lot of people in India into poverty and landlessness. And so it doesn't always work out the way it's planned. And then also it's about improving people's lives. Development, the idea is that tomorrow is better than today. And that we need to do something so that we can make life kind of more and more better for each successive generation and every year. So these are all the things that kind of are encapsulated in that idea of development. And it's something that sometimes we take very much for granted that this is the way the world works. But not only has this concept of development really been fairly new, really in the last 100 years as a way of kind of organizing the economies of the world. There are today people that are very much detractors who don't like the idea of development, and we'll talk a little bit about the perspective that's sometimes called post-development. But there's a question, and when we talk about what makes life better for people, there's all sorts of different possibilities, right? Is it more money? Is it more access to resources? Is it happiness? Is it more education? Is it better health? And so these things this is where it's hard to disagree with the idea that we should make life better for everybody. But when we start asking how should that happen, what things should we focus on? What happens when some people are much better off than other people in terms of inequality? How does that play into this? And so all these things kind of come up. And one of the things is that people sometimes talk about development versus economic development or economic growth. And so a lot of times development is discussed strictly in terms of making more money. In other words, people will talk about a developed country as one that is richer or has more money than a country that doesn't, and that equates to better. And there's some people that of course question this. And this is a quote by a couple of scholars that do research on development, and they say, could it be that development is both the best and worst of human projects? Best in terms of its potential, and worst in terms of its sorry contemporary practice. Now, in other words, sometimes the way it's actually practiced, development doesn't work very well. So this is the definition of economic development from the World Bank, and as you would expect from a bank, they focus and think that life gets better if you have essentially more economic production. So this is their definition, a little wordy, but it's a qualitative change and restructuring in a country's economy in connection with technological and social progress. The main indicator of economic development is increasing GNP, which is gross national product. I'll talk about that in a minute. or gross domestic product, reflecting an increase in the economic productivity and average material well-being of a country's population. Economic development is closely linked with economic growth. So it's the idea that if you want to be better off, you do it by making more money or being more economically productive and growing your economy. But is this what people are really asking for? If you think about the things in your life that make you happy, that you want, certainly some of those things are money-oriented, and we want certain levels of security, and we'd like to live in a house and have access to food and all of that. But just producing more and more every year doesn't necessarily make people happy. And so some people argue that the idea of development has somewhat been hijacked by the bankers, essentially, by the economists' view of the world, and that we are kind of arranging our lives and our economies according to what bankers would like and the way that they're profiting off of more and more production more than we are. And so there's some critiques of this. So with those caveats in mind, let's dig a little bit more into conceptualizations of development. And by doing that, here's key point number 2, is looking at how do we measure development. And one of the key ones, as mentioned in the World Bank definition, is this term gross domestic product. What this is it's the total dollar value of all the goods and services produced in a country over a year, usually. So gross domestic product, for instance, would include things like, not just all the food that was grown and all the steel that was manufactured and the buildings made and the cars made and blah, blah, blah. It also includes services, things like, for instance, paying for education. So like I'm in the service sector, essentially. And so that is considered part of the economy. Or if you go and you get a massage and you pay the massage therapist, that is also part of a service that counts. Or you go to the doctor and get health care. That's also a service that has a dollar value. So all those things together, and we usually do it per person. So gross domestic product per capita means per person. And the reason why is that countries that are really large, like say India, has a giant gross domestic product, but if you actually divide it up per person, it's not very good. And so it means that overall, each individual is not really all that well off. So this is why we do it by per capita, as it says down here, to kind of how wealthy or poor the average person in a given country may be. So if we look at gross domestic product, and this is old data, this is 2005, the United States has shrunk. Let's see, I thought I had another pie chart. The United States share of this has shrunk. China has exploded. They are much bigger than 5.0. They are actually getting close to rivaling, not quite to the United States level, but close, partially because the US has lost some of that percentage and China has expanded dramatically. Japan has shrunk a bit. And so there's been some shifts. Sorry, this data is a little bit old. But if we look at domestic product, gross domestic product per billions, this is not per capita. This is just in general, which is why India comes out so high, right? But if we actually do it per capita, you can see India actually is pretty bad. So this is gross domestic product per capita in thousands of US dollars. So India down here between $2,000 and $5,000 per person per year, whereas here we're over 40. So you can see the countries that really come out well. Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, the Gulf region here, Japan and South Korea. And then the places that are the worst, Central and East Africa and some parts of Asia. And so using this, kind of gross domestic product and that kind of thing, people have divided up the world in a couple of different ways when they talk about different countries. Most people have probably heard the terms first world and third world. During the 20th century, this terminology was developed, and essentially the first world was the world's wealthy, democratic, capitalist nations, the United States, Western Europe, Japan. The second world were essentially the communist countries, China, Soviet Union, Cuba, etc. The third world was then basically everybody else that weren't totally in the first world camp or the second world camp. So it wasn't just an economic it wasn't just an economic characterization. It was also a political one. It meant you were kind of non-aligned. You weren't really with the Soviet Union or the U.S. And that then the battle between the U.S. and Soviet Union during the Cold War had a lot to do with who could get allies in that third world. And so what has, even though now communism is, in the Soviet Union and China to large degrees have kind of collapsed, or certainly not practiced the way that it was in the case of China, this terminology of the second world has kind of disappeared, but we still talk about first world as being kind of wealthy countries and third world as kind of the poor countries, but that's where the origin of these terms came from. Some people also talk about the fourth world, which is places so poor that they're even worse off than third world. A lot of times people will talk about fourth world as things like like the tribal areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan, or areas that are really in really bad shape, like the poor areas of the poor countries, that kind of thing. Another way people characterize it, sometimes people will talk about the global north and the global south, where the north is essentially well off and the south is not. As you can see, they had to get creative with drawing this line to include Australia there in the north, but you get the idea. This was suggested by a old German chancellor, Willy Brandt, and people still talk about the global south, global north. Yeah. One of the things about gross domestic product, though, is that all it's doing is looking at economic production, and so in some ways it's not a very good tool for understanding how decent life is in these places. And so the United Nations came up with a different way of measuring development called the Human Development Index. And this is a combination of three factors, and I'm actually going to start at the bottom. The bottom one has gross domestic product in it per capita, but they do it at what's called purchasing power parity, which means it adjusts for the fact that things cost different amounts in different countries. So for instance, you might make $5,000 a year in India. Well, $5,000 will get you a lot more and a lot further. It'll pay your rent, it'll get you a lot more food in India than it would if you were making $5,000 a year in New York City, right? And so it takes that into account as kind of part of the standard of living. But it takes that, and it also includes a couple other things. Basically, things that center around health and education. For health, they use what is the life expectancy at birth of that country. It kind of gives you an idea of what healthcare is like. And then they use, for education, they take the adult literacy rate, like how many adults, what percentage of adults in that country can read, and then combine it with the enrollments of like elementary school, middle school, and high school. And so if you have a lot of your citizens in schools and a lot of them can read and write, then you show up high on this, even if you don't necessarily have a lot of money. So it adjusts a little bit, and this is the Human Development Index. And you'll see it doesn't look a whole lot different from the thing we just looked at in terms of gross domestic product. One of the different, I'm trying to think if there's anything in green that wasn't kind of high in other instances. Maybe some places like Iceland or Ireland that show up high here. But the things that show up low can be even places that had, showed up a little better on the other place. Like here it shows most of Africa as being really in pretty bad shape in terms of Human Development Index. It shows here, I think, also things are a little better for Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, showing up a little better on HDI than they do in gross domestic product. But it's a little bit more holistic, takes other things into account. So things like the HDI is a traditional measure of how well people's basic needs are being met, but here's the next thing. Having the economic means to provide things is no guarantee that basic needs will really be getting met for all members of society. The people that allocate those resources, the governments, the companies, etc., may choose to direct those to other areas. There are prejudices that exist. There are some members of societies that basic needs are met while others are not. And we know this, right? And this is this idea of that there's inequality in all societies. So saying that the average person in the United States makes $40,000 a year, or that the gross domestic product, which is a little different, $40,000 per person, doesn't mean everyone's walking around with $40,000 a year. As we all know, there are people walking around with billions of dollars and other people walking around with, less than $5,000. And so you also get this other kind of index called the Genie, which is something that focuses on our key point number 3, which is inequality. So the inequality, or the Gini coefficient, is a measure of the inequality in a country, the gap between the rich and the poor. And the red here means the worst, and you can see South Africa, parts of Central Africa. A lot of places that are gray is just no data. They don't have the economic data to make the estimations. And you can see the places that have a lot of equality are here in green. So basically that would be Sweden. It looks like they're all by themselves here. But Canada, lots of parts of Western Europe, etc. And then you can see it gets progressively worse. Places like the United States actually has the same amount of inequality as a place like Mexico or Venezuela or China or Malaysia. So you can see the different levels of inequality. And so there's a video that you'll watch for this module that looks at income inequality in the United States to give you an idea of just what that looks like in reality in terms of the numbers and percentages and the way inequality works here. But one of the things to keep in mind when you're watching that video is that that's just talking about inequality within the United States or within particular countries. Like the Genie index is looking at inequality within a country. It doesn't say anything about what's the difference between the poor in South Africa and the rich, say, in the United States, right? There's global inequalities too. This is just the difference between the rich in South Africa and the poor in South Africa. So globally, there's also, of course, issues with inequality too. All right, so key point number 4 is that there are a lot of different approaches to development today. There's the economic growth approach, which I talked about, which is kind of championed by the banks and all of that. But there's also what's called the basic needs approach, which says we shouldn't just be trying to make more money. We should be putting in programs to directly address the basic needs of people in a society. So for instance, we should build schools or build health clinics or build water wells. That's not going to actually show up in the gross domestic product, but it will make life better for people that don't have access to clean water and education and health care. And so that's an approach to development that kind of differs from the economic growth approach. There are big differences in terms of the importance of income inequality. One of the things that you'll see for your assignment number 3 is that you'll be watching this movie, the first part of it anyway, the first segment of Commanding Heights, which talks about the way in which the global economy was arranged in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. That video will talk about the huge differences of opinion about income inequality and how people should set up their economies. One of the other approaches to development today is the idea of what they call post-development, and it's the idea that development as it has been practiced actually ruins more than it helps. Ruins people in terms of their livelihoods, makes poor people even poorer, doesn't have the intended consequences that that the people doing that hope they will, and also the environmental consequences of all the development. And so some countries have kind of decided to have other ways of defining development. And one of the other videos you'll watch is on the country of Bhutan, which is near India, kind of sandwiched between India and China in the Himalayas. And they decided to reject the idea of measuring development by gross domestic product and have instead what they call gross national happiness. And so you'll see a little bit about that in that video. Okay. So that's really the end of the key points. There are some other slides that are important that talk about approaches to development, such as Walt Rostow's model of development, which has to do with how a lot of development theorists think that you can just keep kind of building everyone's economy up and up and up, and then everybody can become wealthy. And then that's countered with the world systems theory approach, or world systems theory, which says that no, you can't do that, that if you see why there's some rich countries and poor countries, it's because the rich countries are basically exploiting the poor countries, and so we all can't become rich. And so there's some very different ideas, not just about development, but about how the global economy functions and how it should function. So the other videos to watch, right, the one on income inequality, the one on Bhutan and gross national happiness, and then coming up quickly, too, with the same due date, is assignment 3, where you'll be watching Commanding Heights, the Battle of Ideas, getting into those debates over the global economy. All right, and that's it for this particular module. I will see you in the next module on urban geography.